distinguished guests, first let me thank the Stock Exchange of Thailand for inviting me to give a talk at the Thailand Focus this year, and also offer my apologies for not being able to be there in person or not to be able to teleconference in. The logistical arrangements made it so that I had to pre-record this thing just for the record, because there are many developments happening in Thailand now. I want to make sure that the stuff I say doesn't seem too out of date. I'm pre-recording this on the 17th of August. I thought what I'd do in the 25 minutes that they have asked me to speak to you on is share with you my thoughts about economic outlook in Thailand, and along with some observations about our policy response, particularly focusing on monetary policy, but also touching upon some issues related to financial policy and household debt in particular in the case of Thailand. So first off, about our economic outlook. Before I go on in terms of the economic outlook, perhaps I thought it'd be useful for us to do a look back and think about where things were a year ago, pretty much when I last spoke to you at the Thailand Focus last year in August of the previous 2022. And things then were very different. Growth it was coming in fairly slowly. We were recovering. It took us, we got hit very hard from COVID. The recovery was slow and was lagging the region, lagging our comparators. If you look, one part of the reason that we were hit so hard and the economy took a lot of time to recover from COVID was that we're, as you know, an economy that's heavily reliant upon tourism. We closed out the year last year with about 11 million tourists. That's down from the 40 million that we saw prior to COVID. So again, a fairly slow recovery in terms of the overall economic picture. Consumption had been recovering fairly steadily, admittedly off a fairly low base. And at the end of the year, the GDP number, the final outturn came out at about 2.6%. But what was probably top of mind at that point for us, August of last year, was probably less on the growth front, but more also on the inflation front. Inflation at that point was growing as it was all around the world, very, very rapidly. We saw the inflation, headline inflation, in fact, peak in August, pretty much when I was speaking to you last year, at 7.9%. And eventually the outturn for the whole year, it turned in at about 6% headline inflation. And core inflation didn't peak until about December at about 3.2% last year. So that was the picture last year. Fast forward to today, 1 year ahead. And where are we today? Things are on a much firmer ground, much firmer footing. The recovery, I think, is quite intact. If we look, for example, on the growth front, we're finally back to pre-COVID levels as of the first quarter of this year. Consumption has been growing steadily. Both last year, throughout the whole year, it grew at a fairly significant level, above 6%. First quarter of this year clocked in at again over 5%, and the consumption indicators have held up quite strongly, quite well all throughout. So that's quite encouraging. Tourism, which again is the big driver for us and determines kind of the overall picture of the state of the recovery, quite influentially, not just because of its importance in terms of headline GDP, but also very importantly in terms of its employment and income footprint in Thailand, because it directly, indirectly, as many of you probably know, accounts for about 1/5 of our employment. But tourism this year has recovered very steadily. The latest year-to-date figures as of in July, we had about 15 million tourists. And that recovery we expect to continue. And we are maintaining our year-end forecast for tourists of about 29 million. So getting closer back to that pre-COVID level of tourism that we had. But the picture isn't, it's not all wine and roses. There are some soft spots. Exports have come in weaker than expected, significant part to, again, the slower than expected recovery in China. And also some of the tourism spending has also come in a bit softer than expected. So the arrivals in terms of bodies coming in, that's, again, pretty much on track. But in terms of the spending by the tourists, that's becoming a bit softer than expected. In part, again, because of the recovery of tourists from China is a bit slower than expected. So the numbers haven't changed because this drop off in the Chinese tourists have been made up by non-Chinese tourists, but the Chinese tourists tend to spend a lot more. And so the overall spending by tourism has been a bit softer. But that said, again, the overall recovery, we think, on the growth front remains intact. Yes, there is some softness, and growth will probably clock in a bit slower than what we had initially put out in terms of our latest public forecast, which is about 3.6%. But again, the overall recovery still intact. On the inflation front, the disinflation process, inflation coming down, coming off its high that we've been seeing around the world, has been happening here in Thailand as well. And inflation has been tracking down, has come down quite rapidly, in fact, a bit more rapidly than we had expected. Some of the recent outturns in inflation, headline inflation, have come in lower than our forecasts. We saw the latest outturn at 0.4%. Headline inflation, the month before that, it was at 0.2%. Latest core has been running at 0.9%, a bit closer to our forecast. But the headline numbers have come in a bit lower than expected, but I think it's largely transitory, temporary drop off in inflation, having to do with base effects, having to do with some government subsidies on the electricity front. And we expect inflation to gradually pick up both headline and core and gradually come back to within our target range. And there, again, in the overall picture, there's still some upside risk to inflation, particularly for us in the context of Thailand, due to some risks associated with El Nino, which would have an upward impact on prices, particularly in food, and food in Thailand is a big chunk of the consumption basket. So again, some upside risk there, plus some uncertain upside risk due to possible policy measures from the new incoming government, whenever and whoever that may be. But again, the overall picture on inflation is one where, again, yes, some softness, lower than expected in the near term, but again, gradually ramping up and coming back into our target range. Again, I would emphasize that we don't see any kind of risk of, as some commentators have said, about risk of overall deflation picture in Thailand. That softness on the inflation front, again, mostly supply side stuff. We don't see strong kind of broad-based demand side weakness. Consumption, as I mentioned, has been tracking in quite solidly. But that said, inflation will probably again come in a bit slower than or softer than the latest public forecast that we put out, which was headline of 2.5%. But again, the overall picture of recovery remains intact. So that's the main, I would say, is the main takeaway that on the economic picture, which is that the overall recovery remains intact. Yes, there is some softness on both the growth and inflation front. The overall final growth figure for the calendar year will come in a bit softer than the 3.6% figure that with the latest public forecast we had. And similarly on the inflation front, a bit softer than the 2.5% headline figure that we had put out. We'll be coming out with the revised forecast that we can put out to the public in September with our monetary policy report coming out that month. So that's the overall picture on the economic front and the economic context. So the question now is, well, what has been our policy response, and what is it likely to be going forward? And again, I'll spend most of my time comments on the monetary policy front, which is probably of most interest to the audience at this point. So a year ago today, August of last year, was when we did our first policy hike. On the 10th of August, we raised rates from where they were, which was at 0.5%, where they had been for quite at very low levels. And at that point, again, given the given the economic context at the time, our policy objective was what we refer to as trying to ensure a smooth takeoff. Growth had been lagging the region. We'd been recovering much more slowly than other countries around the region. And we started hiking rates even when the economy had not recovered back to pre-COVID levels. So the policy objective at that point was trying to ensure that the economic recovery still continued, again, while trying to maintain inflation, to try to keep inflation expectations anchored without disrupting that slow economic recovery that we were seeing. So given that policy objective of trying to ensure that smooth takeoff, our policy response in terms of normalizing monetary policy, as I mentioned at our meeting last year, was to take what we called a gradual and measured approach towards policy normalization. Meaning that yes, we're going to increase rates to try to keep inflation expectations anchored, to try to address the problem of high inflation. But we're going to do so in a gradual and measured fashion, meaning, no heroic 50, 75 basis points hikes as we're seeing in some of the other countries, but gradual and gradual interest rate hikes, measured, meaning that if we felt the need at any point to try to increase the pace of rate normalization, we would also do so. And the reason for that, again, as I try to explain, hopefully explained reasonably well last year, was that we really saw that the economic context was different in Thailand from other countries. On the growth front, as I mentioned, our recovery had lagged other countries, softer recovery than other countries. And on the inflation front, when we looked at it, and we looked at it in great depth and detail, we saw that it was largely supply side driven. We didn't see much demand side pressure in terms of prices. We saw low risk of a wage price spiral. We saw inflation expectations still anchored. And so we felt that much of the inflation that we saw, and again, it spiked higher than a lot of other countries in the region, that 7.9% headline figure, but that it was largely transitory. And well aware that transitory at that point was a taboo word among central bank policymakers at that time because for reasons that I think you all will know. But we felt that in the case of Thailand, no, it did look transitory, and it wasn't. We should not shy away from treating it as such. And I think if you look now with the look back and the outturns, what's happened on the growth and inflation front, we feel that read was the right one, and the policy response that we decided to take was the right call. The recovery again gradually came back, and inflation again, that disinflation process that we mentioned, if anything, it came in. Disinflation started much faster, and inflation came down faster than we expected. So that was the gradual and measured policy normalization process, where we took the policy rate from 0.5% to our latest MPC meeting. We just met earlier this month, and we raised rates again up to 2.25%. So that's where we are today, where we are at what I would say is a more advanced stage of normalization, and our policy objective, as a result, is now different. We are at an inflection point, and if our policy objective, the way that we characterized it before, was try to ensure that smooth takeoff, policy objective at this point is to ensure to get the landing right, and at our latest Monetary Policy Committee meeting, the statement that was put out, we removed for those analysts that pay attention to this stuff, that gradual and measured language that we had kept in our previous MPC statements to indicate again that we are at an inflection point, that things are different from before, and that we are getting closer and approaching that landing. And so in terms of getting closer to that landing point, what are some considerations that are guiding us? The first is that we will be, as again also pointed out in the latest MPC press statement, paying more attention not just to near-term considerations of growth and inflation, but also looking more at medium-term considerations. So on that, to try to make sure that three things at least are important, as with most longer-term policy normalization considerations. One, trying to make sure that growth returns to its potential, and in Thailand's case, long-term growth potential, given our structural features of the economy, given our demographics and whatnot, we typically expect to see growth coming in between the 3 to 4% range. Inflation, on the inflation front, we like to see inflation remain sustainably within our target range of 1 to 3%. So not just coming in for a while, then leaving it, but trying to make sure that it stays within the 1 to 3% target range sustainably. And third, quite importantly, again, in the context of Thailand, to ensure that the policy rate and the interest rates do not lead to imbalances, financial imbalances in particular. In Thailand, as I mentioned, had kept rates very low for a very, very long time, and those had allowed imbalances to build up, search for yield activities, and also one manifestation of the fact that rates have been low for quite a long time is that household debt had built up quite rapidly in the years pre-COVID. So again, third consideration, trying to make sure that rates are at a level that is commensurate and appropriate for ensuring long-term stability as well, and not allowing all these imbalances to build up. So those are three medium-term considerations that are becoming increasingly important as we approach that landing. The second guiding principle in coming into that landing is to make sure that our policy is guided what we call it's outlook dependent, not just data dependent. And the reason for that is because the data outturns are noisy. They are affected by short-term considerations, short-term noise, base effects, temporary measures and whatnot. And so our policy decisions, if they were to respond excessively to the latest data outturn, as we saw, for example, with the lower than expected inflation outturns, we would be just adding noise to the system. And I think the last thing that policymakers should be doing at this very uncertain time is where there's enough noise and there's enough uncertain system is to make policy add to that noise. And so one thing we've been at pains to emphasize is that our policy decisions would be outlook rather than data dependent. I understand that sounds like it's semantics, but because the outlook obviously is contingent upon the data outturns. But again, in several contexts, particularly as what we see in Thailand recently, the latest data outturn was a short-term thing. It didn't necessarily imply that the long-term outlook had changed, and in most cases we felt that the long-term outlook that we had envisioned in terms of the broad contours of the recovery in both the growth and inflation front remained intact, and that therefore just because you got a recent outturn that came in softer than expected, that would necessitate or any kind of change in policy. Third, guiding principle for in terms of us in terms of policy normalization as we approach that landing is that we would like the landing point to be roughly neutral, roughly close to neutral. So meaning that the landing point is a roughly neutral policy rate. And again, a neutral policy rate is one that is consistent with those three characteristics I mentioned about getting growth back to potential, inflation sustainably within the target, and no imbalances building up. And the reason I emphasize that is because the context in Thailand is different from other countries. We want the policy rate to come as close to that neutral range as much as possible, so that inflation gradually comes back to target and growth slowly comes back to potential. And this is different from a lot of other countries. How is it different from other countries? In a lot of other countries, because inflation was driven in no small part to demand side considerations, and basically the economy being needing to be slowed down. In many countries, the terminal rate, the policy rate, had to shoot above what was the what a normal a reasonable estimate of what the neutral policy rate, that mythical R star, is. But in the context of Thailand, there's no need for the policy rate to kind of exceed or whatever the estimate of a neutral policy rate is. But our job, our goal, our policy objective is to try to get the landing right. We're trying to get the policy rate to slot in to that neutral rate as close or as roughly as much as possible, and all that with the usual caveats about the neutral rate being something that is difficult to precisely estimate. It's dependent upon the models that you use, the assumptions you plug in, so forth. But again, I think we have reasonable estimates for what that likely range of the neutral rate is, and then we'd like that policy rate to slot in as close as possible to what that neutral rate is, which is again a different kind of policy context from what we see in other countries. Last point that I would like to touch upon in terms of policy normalization in the time I have remaining is to move from talking about monetary policy and talking about other aspects of financial policy, and particularly in our context with regard to household debt, which is too high. Our household debt to GDP ratio is at 90.6%. Again, international measures or benchmarks suggest that this ratio should be in the range of roughly 80%. When we look at it and try to assess what the likely path of household debt in Thailand is going forward, we see that even though GDP is likely to recover and the denominators are going to grow, that ratio should be coming down. If we let it just go at that rate, it's not going to come down as rapidly as we would like it to see, consistent with a more sustainable outlook on the household debt front. So, as a result, we recently put out a series of policy packages to try to get household debt to a more sustainable level in a more reasonable time frame. And I'd like to emphasize again that we've always been cognizant of the household debt problem. It's always been something that's been top of mind for us. But the timing of trying to address these issues has to be appropriate for the economic context at the time. And so we pursued a fairly, what I would argue is a flexible and pragmatic approach towards addressing household debt that's evolved with the changing economic conditions and circumstances. So for example, when COVID hit and we had the lockdown, the measure that we were prompted or needed to do, given the situation, was to do a debt moratorium, given that there was a lockdown. We fully recognize that this is not a desirable state of affairs, that it has huge unintended consequences. We don't like doing it. But again, in a situation where there's a lockdown and people don't have incomes, and that we felt that a moratorium at that point, a very short term moratorium, was an appropriate policy response at that time. But again, like with any kind of very strong, harsh measure with these huge unintended consequences, when we saw that the recovery was starting to pick up, slow as it was, we felt that that moratoria approach was no longer appropriate, and we moved to an approach towards where we emphasize longer-term debt restructuring, because the recovery at that point was fairly uneven. Those in the export sector were doing pretty much okay, but those who were tied, for example, in the tourism sector, still hadn't seen their incomes come up, and not for quite some time. So it was important to undertake some debt restructuring that was consistent with their pattern of cash flow. So we embarked on a series of measures, provided incentives basically for banks to do longer-term debt restructuring, consistent with each debtor's needs for those that needed it. That set of measures is expiring at the end of this year. And as we are approaching again a situation where we're going back to normal, and part of the normalization process is to again undo these measures, which have again unintended consequences. And now we are looking to try to address the household debt in a more sustainable and longer term manner. And as we saw when we looked at the numbers, if we allowed everything to kind of continue just by force of inertia as is, we saw that there would be a too slow a reduction in the household debt GDP ratio, and also very importantly that there were some groups out there that with that level of debt that they have and the amount their ability to service that debt, that they would be stuck in debt traps. So we recently put out a package of measures, three set of measures to address the household debt issue. The first is what we call responsible lending. Again, this is the panoply of measures to try to address to make sure that lenders behave in a responsible manner pretty much all throughout the entire debt cycle. So even when getting people to incur their debt, to make sure that there's not false or misleading advertisement saying that you can borrow this much and only pay this much, but leaving aside that if you do that, then you end up having to be in debt for a huge number of years, or that your implied interest rate is actually this extremely high level. Also, that once debtors start to have problems, that you try to address, offer them viable debt restructuring alternatives. And finally, that if the debt needs to be sold, that the borrower is aware of his or her rights. So trying to make sure that the responsible lending guidelines are there to try to make sure that the lenders behave in a responsible fashion kind of throughout the whole debt cycle of the borrower. And one particular measure, which I think is important and alludes back to that, what we were talking about, that certain pockets of borrowers are stuck in a debt trap, is what we call persistent debt. Measures to try to address persistent debt. So trying to make sure that that the groups that if they've been paying over the past 5 years and they have low incomes over the past 5 years, they've been paying much more, paying more in interest than they have in principal payments, that they have an option to close out their debt within a reasonable time frame, 5 years, and at a interest rate not exceeding 15%. And again, but that's a targeted measure for particularly low-income borrowers who have this persistent debt characteristic. The other two types of measures, that set of measures, the responsible lending guidelines, will take place at the beginning of next year onwards, and the persistent debt will take place from April of next year onwards. The other two measures are on risk-based pricing, so trying to get basically pricing of loans to reflect the risk of borrowers, borrowers which are riskier pay more, perhaps more than they're currently paying now, and for lower risk borrowers to be able to pay lower interest rates. That's going to be a sandbox approach, and that will be rolled out starting towards the middle of next year. And the third measure is a macroprudential measure that we are looking at in terms of putting in debt service guidelines, debt service ratio guidelines. But again, we are cognizant that this is a fairly strong medicine, and are looking at potentially putting this in place at the beginning of 2025. But again, we'll be looking at the economic context at the time, and whether it's that kind of measure would be appropriate for whether it's the right time, basically, to implement such a measure. And like I've mentioned, I think one thing that has characterized our approach all throughout is that we have been flexible and we have been pragmatic and not too rigid in our approach. So, but we do see the need to undertake measures to directly address the household debt problem. I think these measures on the policy front, both in terms of monetary policy and financial policy, the example just of the household debt that I mentioned, I think together with some of our longer term initiatives that we are doing, more structural initiatives in terms of on the digital front and on the transition finance front, I think will lay the foundations for a longer term and sustained recovery in Thailand. So with that, let me thank you very much for your attention and wish you a pleasant and productive Thailand Focus. Thank you very much.